Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Today's October 10th, so including today, we are just 25 days from the November 3rd election. And what will happen on that day is anyone's guess. All the national polls show Joe Biden ahead of Donald Trump. But national polls are meaningless because we don't elect our president based on the national vote. We elect our president based on the Electoral College vote. And that means the only polls that matter are the polls in individual states. And even then, not all state polls matter equally. Polls in battleground states matter more. And what I mean by that is California, which is the biggest Electoral College prize, California has 55 Electoral College votes, which is more than 10% of all the 538 Electoral College votes and more than 20% of the 270 needed to win. So California is a big prize, but California will go for Biden no matter what. So it doesn't matter if Biden wins California by 3 points or 30 points, which is what Hillary's margin of victory was 4 years ago. So looking at the battleground states, the states that matter, if we look at those polls, Donald Trump is trailing in all of those too. Now that doesn't mean the polls are right. The polls had Donald Trump losing in 2016 and Donald Trump won. So the only poll that ultimately matters is the one taken on Election Day. But I want to go out on a limb today and give my prediction of the presidential race. I want to go on the record now with it because anybody can pick the lottery numbers after they're drawn, right? I want to make the prediction while it's still a prediction. And 25 days out, well, here's what I think. Back in January, despite all the negative coverage of President Trump, most of it based on lies, I put the likelihood of the president being reelected at 98%. It was all but certain, and the jokes about the Democrats were about which sacrificial lamb they'd put up to be slaughtered by Trump in the re-election. But then came COVID, and all that changed. I now put Trump's chance at re-election at 40%. And that's more generous than the odds makers in European gambling sites who give him only a 32% chance of re-election. We don't have official odds in Las Vegas because betting on politics isn't done in the U.S., not by legitimate gaming companies anyway. But President Trump's numbers fell dramatically after he caught the coronavirus, and they're still plunging. One thing that so few people seem to realize is the narrow margin of victory that Trump had in 2016. Sure, his Electoral College vote margin was wide. He won 306 to 232. But with the exception of Maine and Nebraska, every state is a winner-take-all Electoral College state. So even with a very narrow margin of victory in a state, the winner gets every Electoral College from that state. And when we look at the 5 critical states of 2016, the margins of victory for Donald Trump were very narrow, with the exception of Ohio. He actually won Ohio quite handily. He won Ohio by 8.6%. But he won Florida by fewer than 120,000 votes, a margin of 1.3%. He won Pennsylvania by a little over 68,000 votes, a margin of 1.2%. He won Wisconsin by just over 27,000 votes, a margin of 1.0%. And Michigan, he won Michigan by 11,612 votes, giving him a margin of victory of 0.3%. Now, by winning those 5 states, he got all the Electoral College votes from those states, and those 5 states have a total of 93 Electoral College votes. So if you add up the total votes that constitute the margins of victory in those 5 states, You get 681,858 votes. That represents about 0.5% of the votes cast nationwide. But because it's winner take all, he got 17% of the Electoral College votes. One big advantage that Donald Trump had in 2016 is that he was the outsider. He presented himself as the successful businessman who would come in from the outside, not corrupted by the culture of DC politics. He would drain the swamp and govern the nation with the acumen of a successful businessman. And that was a relatively easy pitch to make 4 years ago. But he's no longer the outsider. I mean, he may still be an outsider, but he's in government. He's the president. So no longer can he run on pointing the finger at others and saying how inept and corrupt they are, because he's part of the system. Now, you may not think he's inept and you may not think he's corrupt, but you have to acknowledge that he can no longer be the outsider pointing fingers. He has to take some responsibility for the State of the Union. And the State of the Union prior to the coronavirus was very good. The State of the Union now is horrible. I mean, our economy is in the toilet. And not just any toilet, it's the toilet at the bus station. Now, is that President Trump's fault? No, I don't think it is. I do think his reaction to the coronavirus was erroneous, but not in the manner most people do. I don't think he failed on how we responded medically to the coronavirus. Where I think the president failed was in going along with the coronavirus panic and the subsequent coronavirus closures that destroyed our economy. I think he got terrible advice from people who did not have his or the nation's best interests in mind, and they convinced him that it would be a 2-week closure, which, if you remember, that's what it was. We were originally going to have a 2-week shutdown to flatten the curve. That was the goal. It wasn't a 2-week shutdown to eliminate the virus. It wasn't a 2-week shutdown to make sure that nobody ever died from this thing again. It wasn't a 2-week shutdown so that nobody would ever go in the hospital. It was to flatten the hospitalization curve, which by their own definition meant a lot of people are still going to end up in the hospital. A lot of people are still going to die. It's just that we're going to spread out those deaths over a long enough period of time that the hospitals can deal with it. The 2-week closure was intended to prevent the hospitals from being overrun with COVID-19 patients. And if you recall, we also set up massive capacity above and beyond what the hospitals could usually do. From Army field hospitals to Navy medical ships, we had massive capacity to deal with the coronavirus above and beyond what we usually would. And if you recall, those field hospitals and those Navy hospital ships went largely unused. And the curve did flatten. The problem is we didn't reopen the economy because the goalposts got moved. It went from flatten the curve to don't reopen until we find a cure. It went from social distancing to stay at home until we, the government, tell you you can leave. It went from it's only 2 weeks to what's it been now? 8 months? Thereabouts? We went from we're in this together to tattletale on your neighbors and we'll arrest them for not wearing a mask while they're having a barbecue in their own backyard. We went from liberty to people being arrested on the beaches for not wearing a mask, even though they're alone, outdoors, in the wind, on a beach. And who has received the bulk of the blame for this? Donald Trump. Does he deserve that? No, not at all. Not in my view. The governors of the states, which with the exception of Ohio and Maryland, are all Democrat governors, they've kept their states shut down. And they've kept their economies decimated. Why? Because they're not getting blamed for it. The president is. It's political. And even though it's not based on truth, it's worked. Tell me how Donald Trump is responsible for New York City restaurants going out of business because they're not allowed to open. He's not. But the dishonest media has said that that's the case. They've allowed Mayor Bill de Blasio and Governor Andrew Cuomo to blame it on the president without being challenged. And the American people believe it. And they blame every death on Donald Trump. And unfortunately, this year is a referendum on Donald Trump. 2020 is not a choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And if you ask the people who are voting for Joe Biden, the vast majority of them couldn't give you a reason other than he's not Donald Trump. The Democrats could nominate Satan, and people would vote for Satan. Why? Because he's not Donald Trump. If this election was truly a choice between what Donald Trump wants to do and what Joe Biden wants to do, Donald Trump would win. If this election was based on the track record of what Donald Trump has accomplished versus what Joe Biden has accomplished, Donald Trump would win. Unfortunately, it's not that. This election is a referendum on Trump. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And for most people, the answer to that question is a resounding no. And as a result, I think Donald Trump's going to lose the election. What's the breakdown on that? I'll share it with you when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So I do expect Donald Trump to lose the election on November 3rd. Now, we may not know on November 3rd, but I don't see him serving a second term. In 2016, Donald Trump won the Electoral College vote 306 to 232. Yeah, I know the official count was 304 to 227, but that's because there were 7 faithless electors. But in terms of states won, Trump won in 2016 306 to 232. And while that sounds like a nice margin of victory, it really wasn't. Hillary Clinton received more of the national popular vote than Trump did. But as we discussed, that's meaningless. But Donald Trump's narrow margins of victory in the critical states gave him that victory. Now, I'm not going to go through those numbers again. I just gave him the last segment. But he won those 5 critical battleground states by very, very narrow margins. Well, except for Ohio. I guess Ohio had a pretty comfortable margin of victory. So what I did for my 2020 projection was that I used the 2016 results as my starting point. And then I adjusted them for this year, state by state. Now, most states will vote this year the same way they voted in 2016. I don't expect Trump to win any states that he lost 4 years ago. So he can only go down in his Electoral College count from 2016. I expect him to lose 4 states that he won in 2016. I think he'll lose Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Well, that's 61 Electoral College votes right there. And I expect Nebraska, which 4 years ago went all Trump, to split with 4 votes for Trump and 1 for Biden. And I expect Maine, which 4 years ago split 3 for Hillary, 1 for Trump, to go all Biden. So that's 63 Electoral College votes Trump got last time that I don't think he'll get this time. Consequently, I predict Joe Biden will win the Electoral College vote 295 to 243. And that's with the president winning Florida and Ohio. And if you believe the polls, and I'm not saying we should, they were wrong bigly 4 years ago, and they may be wrong now, but if you believe the polls, Donald Trump is trailing not only in the 5 battleground states he won 4 years ago, Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Other states that he won are in play this year. He won Arizona by 3.5%. He's trailing now. He won Georgia by 5.1%. He's trailing now. He won Iowa by 9.5%. He's trailing in the polls. He won North Carolina by 3.7%, and he's trailing today. And he won Texas by 9%, and believe it or not, he's tied in Texas. How on earth can Joe Biden be tied with Donald Trump in Texas? Now, of those 5 states, I actually think North Carolina is the only one that Joe Biden wins. I still think Trump will pull out a victory in Arizona, Georgia, Iowa, and Texas. Now, there were 2 states that were very close last time that Hillary won. Minnesota, Hillary only won by 1.6%, little under 45,000 votes statewide. And there are some people who think that Minnesota will go to Trump this year. They base that largely on the violence in Minneapolis and the fact that the voters are just fed up with the rioting and the looting and the arson and the murders and all that, and they want a law and order president. And I hope they're right, but I don't share their optimism. Hillary Clinton won New Hampshire by only 2,700 votes last time. 2,736 to be exact, and that was only a margin of 0.4%. So there are some people who think that New Hampshire is in play this year as well. Now, New Hampshire only has 4 electoral college votes, so it's not a big prize, but hey, every little bit adds up. Now, I hope and pray that my prediction is wrong. I want to be wrong on this. I take no joy in the prediction of a Biden victory, because if Biden wins, America loses. So I really, really want to be wrong on this. But I want to share with you some of the reasons why I predict as I do. I'm not just pulling this prediction out of thin air. The big problem, of course, is the coronavirus and the president being blamed for it, along with the decimated economy, which the president is being blamed for. But the mail-in voting schemes that Democrats are imposing across the country are going to tip the scales in favor of Joe Biden, even beyond what the issues themselves would make happen. Despite what the Democrats and the media, but I repeat myself, despite what they say about there being no mail-in ballot fraud, there most certainly is. And I cited several examples on my August 22nd program, which I encourage you to go back and listen to. The podcasts are archived at www.themikebatesshow.com. Just go to podcasts and scroll down to August 22nd. I cited more than 24 examples of mail-in ballot fraud out of hundreds that I found. I only had time to mention 25. 8 of the 25 that I mentioned, the absentee ballot fraud was proven to have changed the outcome of the election. And that's in court, by the way. Proven in court to have changed the outcome of the election. And in 7 of those cases, the official winner had to resign. And in the case where he didn't, it's because they couldn't prove that the candidate himself knew about it. So don't tell me that there's no such thing as mail-in ballot fraud. There most certainly is. And it most certainly does change the outcomes of elections. Now, they were all local elections, but I'm still outraged by that. And if you're not, the obvious question is, well, how many elected offices in America are you okay being won through fraud? And if there's any decency about you, you'll acknowledge that the answer to that is 0. Now, is there going to be enough mail-in ballot fraud to change the outcome of the presidential election? Very hard to say, but the Democrats sure are trying. Absentee ballots themselves are not bad. If a state has the process already in place, where a voter can request an absentee ballot and vote by mail, that's perfectly acceptable. The problem is when Democrats, either through last-minute legislation or worse, executive orders from tyrannical governors that simply change the law at the last minute to allow for universal mail-in voting, meaning that instead of somebody having to request a ballot, the ballot is simply mailed to every registered voter. That is going to open up the opportunity for massive and widespread voter fraud. And is it enough to change the outcome of the presidential election? You heard earlier how close some of these races are. So yeah, it's quite possible. As we discussed on my September 12th episode, which is also archived as a podcast at themikebatesshow.com, the percentage of the national vote properly targeted that needs to change, switching a vote from Trump to Hillary in 2016, or in this case, switching what would have been a 2016 vote for Trump into a 2020 vote for Biden, only 39 thousandths of a percent would need to change. So properly targeted in the battleground states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, only 39 thousandths of a percent would need to switch for Joe Biden to win. And if we're not talking switching, but actual fraudulent ballots, double that, and only 78 thousandths of a percent of the vote needs to be fraudulent for Biden. Assuming 2020's vote is what 2016's was, if Democrats can get 78 thousandths of a percent to vote for Biden through mail-in ballot fraud, Biden wins. You don't think they can pull that off? Like taking candy from a baby. Now, Republicans have challenged various aspects of mail-in voting in courts across the country. But judges have ruled for Democrats in battleground states, including Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where courts this month held that mailed ballots arriving within certain time periods after Election Day must still be counted. Never mind that the law says otherwise. The courts have ordered that the established law be ignored. In Tennessee, which is not typically a battleground state, but could be tipped in favor of Joe Biden, a federal judge ruled that elections officials could not require an ID for someone voting by mail. Now understand, Tennessee law requires an ID for the first time somebody votes by mail, but a dictator wearing a robe single-handedly overturned Tennessee election law, and through judicial fiat is going to allow people to vote by mail without proving their identity. Can you think of an easier way for the Democrats to commit voter fraud than that? So without question, the Democrats are going to stuff the ballot box. The question is, will it be enough to steal the election? And then the other question is, does the election even need to be stolen? Because President Trump is not without blame for his horrible poll numbers. I'll explain when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Donald Trump is not without blame for his horrible poll numbers. His biggest problem is that he is an inarticulate carnival barker who will say whatever he thinks needs to be said at the moment to get you to pay that dollar to enter his tent, with no concern as to whether or not it's true. And his messaging is horrible. It is all over the board. There is no discipline to his tweets. There is no discipline to what comes out of his mouth. He pays very little attention to what the truth is, and he just says what he thinks will persuade you at that moment. And so he does a lot of backpedaling. And of course, his positive tests for COVID didn't help matters. Because while sure, anybody could have gotten it, including the president, and from what we understand, although it's not proven, from what we understand, he probably contracted it from Hope Hicks. But it has been presented as he caught it because he won't wear a mask, because he doesn't take science seriously, because he thinks COVID is a hoax, because he's just this terrible human being who thinks he's invincible and doesn't believe in science. Now, I think that's a false allegation, but the allegation's made and people believe it. And then he does stupid things like going for a joyride in an SUV around Walter Reed Hospital. What was the point of that? Well, I know the point of it. His supporters were out lining the streets, holding signs in support of the president and wishing him well. And he wanted to go and acknowledge that. Well, he could have acknowledged that support through a video message from the hospital. He didn't have to go in a joyride where he left the hospital, rode in his little motorcade for about a mile, and then went straight back to the hospital. You know, it would have been different if he was going back to the White House via motorcade. At least the motorcade would have had a destination. But to leave the hospital and go right back to the hospital was pointless. And frankly, irresponsible. Because he was still positive with the coronavirus. And he's in an enclosed SUV with Secret Service agents. Sure, they were all wearing a mask, but we've already discussed how masks are actually quite inefficient at filtering out the virus. They're nearly useless. And it made him look irresponsible. It made him look like he doesn't value the lives of the Secret Service agents sworn to protect him. It made him look like a showman, which is what he is. You know, the diagnosis alone was bad enough, but to pull that stunt was inexcusable. And I can't imagine that his advisors recommended it. The problem is, I don't believe he wants advisors who are going to recommend against anything he wants to do. I think he wants to be surrounded by yes men, or even if they did object, he dismissed it. Because he always thinks he's the smartest man in the room, no matter who else is in the room. Well, he's not. And this close to an election, everything the president does has to be looked at through the lens of will it help him or hurt him in the election. So here's my question to you, because I know some of you listening are just fine that he rode around in that SUV. And you think I'm being overly critical. So let me ask you this question. How many votes did President Trump gain from his joyride? And the second question is, how many votes did he lose from his joyride? I don't think he gained any. I think the people who think that joyride was a wonderful thing were going to vote for him no matter what. I think it could only cost him votes. He didn't gain any votes from it. It was a short-sighted play to his base, which was already enthusiastically in support of him. He didn't need to do it. You know, it's kind of like during that first debate when he kept interrupting Joe Biden. I was disgusted at his behavior. Now, many of his supporters are like, oh, Mike, are you kidding me? He dominated. He was great. He showed strength. He didn't let Biden get away with the lies. Oh, yeah, he had to do that. He didn't let Biden speak, and they celebrated it. Sure, the very enthusiastic Trump supporters may have thought that that was a good thing. But how many votes did that behavior gain him? I think none. How many did it cost him? Well, I don't know, but it's certainly some. Do you think he picked up any undecided voters by behaving like such a jackass during that debate? I don't think so. I don't think he gained any votes. He only lost some. And the election last time was so close that he can't afford to lose any. And of course, he has no tweet discipline to speak of. Now, I don't have time to go through 4 years of horrible tweets, but we can address one. On Tuesday, President Trump sent out a tweet announcing that he's ending negotiations with the House on a coronavirus relief bill. And while he tried to blame the breakdown of talks on Nancy Pelosi, saying that she was negotiating in bad faith, the fact of the matter is that Republicans couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag. And they sure as hell have no strategy to win the propaganda war being waged against them by Democrats and their allies in the activist press. Because of Donald Trump's stupid tweet, the story was that Republicans are single-handedly denying aid to the American people. What Republicans should have done instead of just ending talks and blaming Pelosi for it, because the American people won't ever believe that it was Pelosi's fault because the so-called news media tells them it wasn't, was to pass the coronavirus relief bill that they want in the Senate. A filibuster would have been unlikely because if Democrat senators tried to filibuster it, then the story would be that Democrats are blocking the bill. So it would pass the Senate. And at that point, the Republicans would be on the record with their proposal. And good or bad, at least they'd have a proposal. As it is now, the perception is that Democrats have a plan because they love the American people and want to help them get through this crisis that the evil, uncaring orange man created. But Republicans are only interested in helping their greedy rich friends and are happy to see the American people suffer because they hate the common man. That's not the case, of course, but that's the perception, and perception is reality. And this close to an election, that perceived reality will cost Republican votes, both for president and for Congress. And that danger to Republicans in close House and Senate races is why Trump tried to backpedal a bit on Wednesday. But that vacillating, wishy-washy, knee-jerk messaging makes Trump look erratic. Of course, he is erratic. How many times over the past 4 years has Donald Trump announced one thing and then changed his mind after being attacked for it? Too many to remember, that's for sure. And that's not a sign of him listening to his fellow Republicans, because if he was listening to his fellow Republicans, he'd seek their advice and counsel before sending out a midnight tweet that he retracts at noon. He'd be strategizing with a party to put out consistent messaging. And it would be better worded, too. It's hard enough for Republicans to get their message in front of the voters because the dishonest activist press is always against them. But to fight amongst themselves because the president completely destroys any hope of winning independent voters to the GOP. Who the heck is advising this guy? Well, that's the problem. No one's advising the guy. Donald Trump just shoots from the hip with whatever he happens to be thinking at the moment. And that's no way to govern. And it's certainly no way to run a campaign. Look, I'm going to cast my vote in favor of Donald Trump. He'll get my vote because the alternative is far worse. But I'm no fan of Donald Trump. He's accomplished a lot. Look, I actually do give him credit for what he managed to accomplish prior to the coronavirus. But this year, he has completely collapsed. Not all of it's his fault. I acknowledged that earlier. The coronavirus wasn't his fault, but he's been blamed for it. And I think it's going to cost him the election. I hope and pray I'm wrong, because our nation cannot survive a Biden-Harris administration, especially if the Democrats also take the Senate, which if they take the presidency, they'll take the Senate. And, of course, keep the House. It is critical that Donald Trump win on November 3rd. Which brings me to the closing question. When will we know who won? I'll give you my thoughts on that when the Mike Bates Show continues.